Not again.
How? Again?
Again.
What's again?
Hello, welcome to another episode of the Exploding Appendix podcast. In this one, we'll be joined by Esther Leslie and Sam Dolbear to discuss their new book, Dissonant Waves, which creatively explores the life and work of Ernst Schoen.
Yeah, this book feels like one where the process of creating it is evident throughout the text. It's not like a conventional intellectual biography, and I sense that reflects a particular journey you went on making it. Could you tell us a little bit about how the book informed and how your journey influenced its creation?
Yeah, thanks so much, Bradley, for having us. Esther was my PhD supervisor, and in 2018 or something, Ernst Schoen's son, who's called Sasha, called Birkbeck, where Esther works, trying to find or make contact with her. I think Sasha had seen some of your work on Benjamin, and Schoen was a friend of Benjamin from school. And I think there was like an attempt to make contact. Maybe you tried to call back, didn't quite work out. There was some emails exchanged. And then eventually you spoke. And Sasha, I think, was very excited to meet Esther. And I just submitted my PhD. And I remember, Esther, you saying that there was this picture of Ernst Schoen in my PhD, like looking out. So then Esther asked if I wanted to join. And we went round to their house in North Finchley in London to meet them. So in some ways, the foundation of the book was sort of personal in some sense. Obviously, it was intellectual, but it was about meeting this guy, Sasha, who was born in 1929 to Ernst Schoen. I remember the moment he came out into the room and you got the sense of what he had been through and everything we came to know about his life and his father's life. You could see his father in him, I guess. They have a likeness to each other. And the fact that I had become obsessed in some ways with the work of Walter Benjamin, and Esther led the MA when I at Birkbeck, also with Julie. He had met Benjamin when he was very young. So there was this sense of history kind of landing in the room or something. And then we would just kind of go round for coffee and cake and hear stories of their lives together.
There is a book in German called In the Beginning Was Radio. And half of it was on a man called Hans Flesch. We were on a radio station in Germany, and half of it was on his father, Ernst Schoen. And his initial ideas was kind of, well, maybe we could translate this book because he felt his father hadn't got his view in the English-speaking world. But I think for us, immediately, we didn't want to be translators of someone else's work, which was good work, but, relatively straight in a sense. We wanted to explore the fullness of Ernst Schoen and also tell about his life in England, which really hadn't been told at all. And so we sort of took on the mission, but we subverted it to become our story, I guess. And then that posed various problems. We were working on it for 5 years or something. Sam was living in Berlin at a certain point. I was in London. So a lot of it was sort of, Google Drive docs and back and forth and meeting at the Koblenz archive where Schoen's archive is kept. Images of that so we could sort of carry it away and work on it in our separate locations. And then, really decide how to tell this story. So I love the fact that Bradley picks up on it as sort of experimental form and that there are shifting registers within it, which for us was a way of trying to be true to the materials and the story as they came to us. So when we were writing about Weimar, we adopted much more of a magazine-like montage mode because that was the milieu and environment that Schoen was working in. There's more diaristic elements when he becomes more private person, having to articulate private thoughts in his diary and living public life elsewhere. So it was all about eventually trying to modulate a large body of material that we didn't want to just be a biography of a man from the moment he's born to the moment he died. Because partly I think, Sam's PhD work was very much about circles and generations and friendship and milieu and who touches who and who makes what possible for whom. And when you get split apart, what happens, what fills the gap. So we really wanted to see Schoen as a kind of emblem or mascot or bellwether or lightning rod, something through which the centuries' energies pass. It's a bit like Zelig-like in the sense he's there at all these particular moments. So we use that. We use them to structure all of that. But at the same time, we hope to be telling a broader story about the fate of modernist, communist, utopian thinking as it travels through the 20th century. Hits Nazism and how it hits him and the efforts to come out the other side, which are and remain, I think, within the book.
I guess also the journey was one of form because we also reimagined the project at different points. At one point we did like a staging of a live radio broadcast where we imagined ourselves kind of time traveling and using acetate, like projecting stuff. And we had actors for a radio play. And so at one point we thought we might just publish something like that, like keep to the form that he was familiar with. But then we thought, no, we'll do like a book. And we also produced like a dance in Warsaw just at the start of the pandemic, which was also quite an amazing moment in the history of our project, where we went to the archive and found like a flyer of a dancer who was wearing a kind of jumpsuit with all of these geometric shapes, holding these boards like attached to his arms. We found out that he was the second husband of Anita Berber, the cabaret dancer from 20s Berlin. And it was like a flyer. So there's like a picture of him. And then there's like a list of all of these composers, the music that Henri danced to. And we thought like, this is exciting stuff. This is just a leaflet in the archive. But then we found a costume designer and some dancers to reimagine the dance. And Samuel Draper, who's like Walter Benjamin's great grandson, who's a composer and organist and pianist. He played the piano to the
pieces that Schoen would have paid and played. And then, we've got two dancers to dance to it, to try and realise it in that way and re-invoke a sort of avant-garde spirit in contemporary Warsaw. We're in quite a radical milieu of people who were fighting their own sort of anti-repression issues on the streets at the time. So it was sort of Weimar reimagined, and they were part of the movement that talks about reimagined Bauhaus as well. And making those links, because I think also the work is not just historical, of this happened then, and we can tie it all up. Part of the motivation was to think about the life of an anti-fascist.
A model almost.
Yeah, and they find themselves exposed to fascism in the 30s, and everything that comes out of that. And here we were in a period which I don't think has finished, but Trumpism and various types of populism were on the rise. So again, now in the return of certain political projects and how people interpart with politics, particularly culturally. We got some of those performed at Bishopsgate Institute in London before it cancelled its cultural programme. I think it might be.
That's online, yeah. It's really on Facebook. It's not the easiest stuff to listen to, though.
Who was Ernst Schoen? And how would you describe his significance in relation to the intellectual and cultural movements of his time?
It's funny because I'd come across him, as many people have, always the same way. Walter Benjamin wrote a letter to Ernst Schoen and said, this sort of figure who, for some reason, this much more illustrious, famous figure, Walter Benjamin, would write letters to.
So he's like a recipient and you're making him an agent.
Yeah,
exactly.
When you look into him, though, he's a friend of Benjamin's from childhood. So they're at school together. So effectively, the best friend of Benjamin. They remain friends all through their life. Schoen died in 1960, Benjamin governed up in 1940. So Schoen outlives it. But they were close in Berlin around the time of the First World War. And they had a number of friends in common where they're all sort of thinking through what can youth do. We live in this monstrous, at that point, imperial society that goes in stages of war, gets involved in war that we don't want to fight in. Together, they're reading Baudelaire, they're reading Nietzsche, they're reading Ibsen, and they're outside of school, because their school is a pretty traditional training, so they're reading circles and educate themselves. And then all of that group kind of go off, make certain kinds of impacts on the world through writing, art, various kinds of action and agitation. So he's a Berliner who comes from a fairly working class background. I mean, his father disappears when he's quite young. I think he went to New York or somewhere. Mother brings him up alone, and so he goes and lives with another wealthier friend who's part of the circle at home for a while. He's a bright lad, though. He can do languages well, and he's clearly very technically gifted. So he goes and becomes a translator in prisoner of war camps.
Did his mum work?
Not sure. She did, not aware of the job, actually. It probably would have come up. He meets a lot of Russians, so prisoners of war, and becomes interested in Russian
There's this shoe thing where he's paid to wear in people's shoes and hide clothes.
Yeah, so he takes fairly menial jobs. When he gets out of the army, he starts working for the media of the day, Telegraph, services, press agencies. But from that, eventually gets into radio, and that's when he really becomes, the person who he would be celebrated as. He's the person who builds up radio in Frankfurt, 1924. He's called to basically develop this radio station, which then is the most exciting thing to do. And they have free reign, and Weimar radio, very experimental. There was no sort of pattern as to what it should be. It was sort of state authorized, but it wasn't state run. So we'll probably talk more about this at another point, but he starts to develop really innovative programming, part of which, and what he's probably most famous for, is getting this friend Walter Benjamin in to do these extraordinary radio programs about the earthquake in Lisbon, or Berlin dialects, or buying toys in Berlin, swindlers, So he makes it possible for Benjamin to move out of the sort of cloistered literary arena and come and do programs for young people, basically, where Benjamin doesn't compromise on his theoretical ideas, but he puts them into forms that are digestible, in a sense, for younger people. And also Ernst Schoen, is behind one of the first listening plays at Hirschfield, which is a particular genre, kind of radio plays, sound effects, terribly sort of meta most of the time. It's kind of always about radio itself and what does it mean to be sitting alone in a collective experience.
When did radio first kind of start to kind of obtain in Germany?
Yeah, about then 20. So the first radio broadcast experiments would be early 20s, and then 24, then it's a decisive.
This is when this is happening.
So he's there. He's a pioneer right at the start, trying to shape radio. But of course, 9 years later, different regime comes in. He escapes. And that's an interesting story to talk about. And manages to get out and come to London. I mean, the rumour is that Lord Reith himself at the BBC is there to meet him. But this sort of promise, amazing German radio guy, he's so innovative, he's so technically really gifted, he understands technology and everything, and he's got ideas. And he comes to England and he gets a job at the BBC, and then there's just no place for him. They're not interested. So the second half of our book is sort of about how he tries to deal with a marginalisation. He's oppressed, imprisoned, and then escapes in Nazi Germany and marginalised. And he's sort of re-marginalised for kind of cultural reasons, because the BBC is just not that kind of organisation that's up for experimentation or avant-garde. So those years, he's not a celebrated figure. He's trying to make a way, translating, being a broker between the left-wing playwrights in English, being performed in Germany. Once the Nazi regime's over, go back to East Berlin in 1958, having been spied upon in this country as part of the communist circle. Goes back to East Germany, and then in 1952, died in 1960, relatively young, 60-something.
There's this very moving moment to his biography when he dies in Berlin. His wife puts a notice in the newspaper, Johanna, she's called, And it says like Ernst Schoen, pioneer of Frankfurt radio or German radio, died at the hands of the National Socialists. And this is that the right way of doing it?
Yeah.
Right.
Her argument was they took away, his livelihood, his reputation, everything. And so effectively it was a kind of slow death afterwards. Adorno, who's someone who flips in and out of his life, takes this completely seriously and completely freaks out. Well, did Nazis go into a Berlin hospital in 1960 and kill him? Sure. You can't sort of understand it conceptually. And then when he realizes it's a kind of metaphor, and he's also a poet all his life. So he's a really active figure.
I guess he's also interesting because he sort of tries everything at least once. Like maybe there's 2 examples of the Brechtian anthem, and there's a set of art songs, and there's a set of songs for children, and there's it feels like he's experimenting at least once with everything.
Esther, in Walter Benjamin Overcoming Conformism, you describe Benjamin's anthropological materialism as refusing formal aesthetics and bloodless philosophizing, and instead entering drawing rooms and attics, spaces and scenes of historical material traces. You add that materialism, in Benjamin's sense, assumes an interaction between people. And I feel that Dissonant Waves embodies this kind of materialist approach. Would you agree? And could you elaborate on how this perspective might shape your book?
Do you agree with yourself?
So like people through whom the energies and the motifs of the time flow, and I guess we use Schoen, in that way that you can embody history. People live through it, and it's not just that it happens to them, but they make it, and part of that making is finding others who think the same and acting together. And so I think it was important for us to see Schoen as part of a constellation of people who had similar aims, and the discussions between them and the fractures between them, because I think we do need to close sort of historical forces in human actions, while being mindful that people can't just willfully act in this way or that way. They are subjective as well as being subjects of history and what happens to them. I think that's how I would sort of think about that anthropological materialism, and that there is some of it happens at the level of the chance encounter, and that all of this is being absorbed. I mean, one of the innovations in our book, I think, was to use Schoen's dreams as a historical resource, because he wrote down his dreams almost obsessively, as they all did. I mean, Benjamin wrote down his dreams, the book of Adorno's dreams. They were all fascinated in the unconscious and how you process your own self in your dreams. And those dreams in Schoen were littered with people, and sometimes we didn't know who they were, and sometimes it's very obvious who they were, and sometimes they were named. That's a realm in a sense where we felt the real anxieties and hurts and hopes of Schoen were expressing themselves. It wouldn't normally necessarily be a kind of legitimate place to look for historical evidence, I guess. So I think that's also part of it. I mean, I think it also relates to that, the kind of the circles and the way in which you started thinking about a lot of it through. Because Benjamin himself, you should explain it, wrote a map or a chart.
So you open this book discussing 4 rings that Walter Benjamin mentions and shares between a small circle of friends that included himself and Schoen. Benjamin notes that the people who had surrounded me drew close together to form a figure. Sam, you have also written Hand That Touch This Fortune Will, about Charlotte Wolfe, another friend of Benjamin's. So it's about Charlotte Wolfe, another friend of Benjamin and Schoen's. How does friendship play a role in understanding these figures?
Yeah, so the smaller book there is out this summer, Hand That Touched the Scorching Well, a history and theory of hand reading. So I think if you go along these slides, we might get to Schoen as a child. We can narrate them as we go. But this is actually the ring we think that.
On his finger.
Yeah.
Actual ring that was bought in 1913 or something.
Very early.
In Berlin on the crown. By the wealthy one in the circle, Alfred Kuhn, who showed like this.
That's Henri in the jumpsuit that we recurated, 1924. Some old cuttings. That's from the Evening Standard, isn't it? Yeah. He corrects it in the corner, not for the BBC. So he's just arrived in England. This is anti-German, anti-Jewish stuff in the papers at the time. Lots of these old diaries, tiny pocket diaries, folders of them at the archive. So we looked through them all, tried to piece together his life in those years. He was part of an opera group, which was quite a sort of more pedestrian.
Yeah, a little bit middle of the road.
Some of the anti-fascist work. Yeah, if you keep going, I think we should get to this stuff. Yeah, this is Charlotte Wolff. So she was a friend of Benjamin's from the early 20s. They became friends. They would read Baudelaire together. I think it was quite romantic friendship in a way. And she would also go to lesbian bars in the west of Berlin with Schoen and also Benjamin. She was a doctor. And then in 1933, she was arrested on one of the U-Bahn platforms in Berlin for dressing androgynously, like suspected of being a spy. So she got papers, left Berlin and got to Paris the day after, where she took up hand reading as a way to make a living. And there she met up with their friend, Benjamin's friend as well, this person called Helen Hessel, and got to know all these kind of circles of surrealists. And she read the hands of Max Ernst and Man Ray, who took this picture. Lots of, those groupings in Paris, lots of other circles. She also meets Aldous Huxley, who brings her to London and meets Virginia Woolf and Lady, how do you say this person's name? Lady Ottoline Morel. Yeah. That set in London. Then she eventually she settles in London, lives in Chelsea, and writes 2 books about sexuality and gender, one on bisexuality and one on lesbian love between women. And she lives until 1987, so a very long life. And in the final year, she writes a 600-page biography of Magnus Hirschfeld, the founder of the Institute of Sexology in Berlin. So she goes all kind of full circle back to her time in Berlin. And so I found her in the same way that I kind of found Schoen on this diagram of friendship that Benjamin drew in 1934. That's Sasha reading something. I was recording him. This is it. So in 1934, Benjamin sits this moment of like sudden illumination and writes out a map of all of his friends. He calls them his primal acquaintances. And so he doesn't think...
Sorry, his what acquaintances?
Primal. They're not people he supposedly meets through others. They're people he meets by chance encounter. So it might be someone at the bus stop or traveling. Yeah, that's how it's mapped out in a different form. So you see Ernst Schoen there, and then Charlotte Wolff, and below. And there's lots of amazing people here who are also kind of marginal to these histories in a way. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, Ernst Bloch, Emmy Hennings was like a puppeteer, Dadaist. That's Benjamin's son, Stefan Benjamin. Dora is his wife. Max Pollock is this amazing guy who ended up in the US, and when he was a kid, his parents installed a grandfather clock in his room, in his bedroom, which stopped him being able to sleep. And instead of removing the clock, they sent him to see Sigmund Freud in Vienna. It led to all sorts of traumas, like he started not being able to urinate. It's like really quite extreme things. And this played out because of the clock installation. Asya Laxis was a Latvian theatre producer, also children's theatre that Benjamin also had a relationship with. Gershon Scholem, who was a Jewish theologian, friend of Benjamin's from early on. Yeah, lots of people. Doris von Scholten, she's interesting. She had a photographic practice where she would ask her boyfriend at the time, Franz Hessel, to pose, but she was actually taking pictures of people in the background. And she also did hat modeling in Paris in the 1920s. So this is how I kind of came across Schoen, and I think it's maybe a good illustration of how we also treated Schoen in a way. Like we were doing this mapping project through the book in a different form.
And there's things like, seating at a cafe, or there could be this kind of branching of something to do with transmission and technical diagrams. And all sorts of different ways we try to conceptualize the diagram in relation between people and, what each, or a chemical. Benjamin has this idea about elective affinities that he takes from Goethe, but elective affinity is the German word for chemical bonding. Also about, what attracts people to each other, elements of repulsion, how you can think about that in terms of magnetics and electricity, which is something Schoen was fascinated in, because he writes these big histories of broadcasting, beginning with magnetism, electromagnetism. He never managed to get published, so there's this interest in the history and the historicity of that within which you operate, but it's not always easy to find audience, I guess.
But maybe what's also interesting about this diagram is that it was written or, sketched out at a moment of also fragmentation of this generation. So he writes it precisely at the moment where it's no longer possible to see these people or locate them even. And that's like a particularly moving thing in the correspondence of this generation, where they're displaced and they're moving around, and they're not only trying to make sure people are okay, but they're also trying to just locate people. And so I think, to go back to the question a bit, that's how I started to try and think about friendship as this means of survival, of a way of getting through history's adversity. And maybe that's more of a concept of solidarity in some ways.
But it's also where radio came to take on a resonance, because while they're being scattered across borders, there is this possibility, sometimes utopian, sometimes actual, that you might be able to tune in, you might be able to transmit, you might be able to somehow keep in touch. Yes, so that's why radio sort of sits alongside the sense of scattering and distribution and dispersing as potential form of connection. But then these other forces cut against it. So, the German radio, the Volksempfänger thing, the one that everybody had to, it was tuned to a single station, making that sense of expansion impossible.
What's also interesting is Charlotte Wolff, Dora Kellner, loads of these people, not loads, but a significant number of them with Schoen ended up in London. But there's no sign that people really hung out after 1933 because of that displacement, like a displacement from a context that made sense. And one thing we tracked also in the book is we have these roll calls. So we're like, in 1934, where is everyone? This person's in Barcelona, this person's in Italy, this person's in Palestine, and then we repeat it also with the dreams. So in 1952, where is everyone? But where is everyone also in Schoen's dreams? And he's not hanging out with Dora, who also lives in London, or hanging out with Charlotte Wolff, who also lives in London, but they appear in these strange ways suddenly 20 years after last encounter in a dream. And we try and map that kind of dissonance between reality and fantasy. So character assassinations.
Helped when he was in London, and he definitely wasn't helped when he went back to Berlin, as he's sort of pleading letters to Adorno, Brecht and people, and no one can come up with anything for him. So as a returner, he's still just lost.
That rain?
No.
It's a fan, isn't it? It's quite dramatic, sudden rain.
Yeah, in your discussion of Schoen's approach to radio, you note that for him, the very performance of drama on radio is a fragmented, refragmented, and remontaged process that bears little relation to the physical completeness of theatre. This parallels Walter Benjamin's interest in montage and also resonates with your own approach to writing this book, where you adopt something resembling radio interference. So you describe drifting between publicity and private sources, real and unreal, waking and dream worlds, the documented and the spoken, the fact, the secret, the official, and unofficial forms. How did the montage-like nature of radio influence the work of Schoen, Benjamin, and even your own work?
I just think because at the start of the book, we used this image of, we wanted to imagine that we were like in a car driving like through some country lanes or something. I don't know why I always imagine it to be kind of bucolic, but the idea you have the old car radio and you're like trying to listen to something, but other things keep interfering. And that was always my image of the style of montage we wanted to develop, because it comes precisely out of the magazine culture of the time, where you're like trying to read a novel, but you're distracted by this puzzle, or, you know, you're reading a piece of news, but then there's like a dream published on the other side of the page.
Yeah, and I mean, say as well that we were very conscious. You know, biography, if it gives a kind of illusion that we know exactly what it was like, exactly what he was thinking, that would be a lie. You know, we can't reconstruct everything. So, you know, sometimes it tunes out and there's a kind of uncertainty or a fragmentation of the signal, and we want to make that obvious. So in the chapter we wrote about Schoen's escape from Germany, which is a very exciting story, that takes on a little bit like, not quite a detective mode, but almost like a fictional mode, because we realised very soon that the family stories, what Sasha and the others, and Sasha's wife later, would tell us, didn't quite tally with the little diaries that we had, and didn't quite tally with some of the sources, newspaper, public sources that existed. So we were...
But the diaries also might be wrong, right? It's like we wanted to hold to the truth of...
weaving between different accounts and making it clear you can't have an absolute knowledge of this. And at the heart of it is this big secret that Schoen never knew, and that was revealed to Sasha's wife on and Schoen's wife's deathbed, effectively, about how she managed to use sexual favours with an SS man to get Schoen released from prison. That sort of tallies with the diary. You know, there's a lot of speculation, and we wanted to keep open the many ways that could be recounted or thought about, the different investments that different people would have in the ways in which it was told. I think the other thing I wanted to say was, you know, how Schoen worked with radio, I think is the classic, what for me is enduring within avant-garde approaches, and that is the truth to the medium. What are the capacities of this medium? And for him, the medium was the media of radio. What is the point of having a symphony concert just broadcast on the radio? Here we have this capacity to use studios and multi-tracks and microphones and, you know, interruption and all sorts of stuff. So that is what we mobilize. And that means we need to write music differently to do that. And we have this capacity for school children to have programs or trade unionists to have debate programs. Is an inherently democratic medium in which anyone should be able to come in front of the microphone and put their point of view and have discussions. And it should be a two-way medium. I mean, Brecht had said that quite literally, and that he said every broadcaster and sender has the capacity to be a receiver, but that's just, you know, not how radio was then marketed. But, you know, at least we can have things like kind of Radio Times, which Schoen was also sort of edited or very in control of. And that, you know, was a beautifully modernist magazine of wild, fragmentary stuff and some conventional stuff and humorous stuff. And he would get people like Kurt Schwitters, whoever who he knew needed a bit of money to do both the radio lecture and then a little radio feature in the radio magazine. It was a very literate culture at the time, generally, anyway, with lots of reading material. Every sort of listener would read it, sometimes quite literally. They would be listening to music and following the score along home. It's an enthusiasm for the medium, but also to push its capacities to do the things that it does best because of how it is technologically. And I suppose we would like to have assumed a sort of sense of that within the old-fashioned enduring medium of the book, that we could have the more magazine format or the diaristic or the detective narrative, you know, the different ways in which would be maybe like Joyce's every chapter, a different kind of literary modus in a way.
But in some ways, when we got to London, the book becomes a more conventional biography. And at first that wasn't intentional, but it was because the materials we were dealing with were less modernist, less avant-garde.
Those images had gone and it sort of depletes. Yeah. But yeah, that's kind of how we understood what was happening. I mean, even the sort of, the radical aspects, the communist aspects become that quite sort of lumpy post-war theatre-based communism, I guess, which doesn't quite have the sparkling disruptiveness of pre-war radical culture.
This idea, to me, is quite startling of listening to Walter Benjamin, for example, talking about Tories, in that when you talk about the sort of democracy, anybody is listening to that, whereas it'll be a very particular sector who would seek out that as a written, being read to is very, very particular and very, very different from reading yourself. And that is what radio is. It's like to me, it's like being read to, and you receive the information in such a different way, I think.
So he has this sense of the way in which radio enters the home. It's like disruptive, and also the early forms of radio, people wore headphones.
And did everybody have a radio then? Was it? It went up massively between 1924 and 1913. It just exploded. The license fee was pitched relatively low, that the sort of working family could get one. The radios themselves, basic ones, were fairly cheap. Obviously, you got those whole walnut wood cabinet, blah blah, room, 18. They could go if you like, but I think the entry point was pretty affordable if you were working.
This question of the body, though, is really important because Benjamin also has this idea in relation to film, that film has this capacity to innervate, enliven the nerves, it changes the body, it creates a reaction, it causes something. And I think, there's a similar process with radio. We found these amazing articles from maybe 26 or something, where there's discussions in the newspaper around what haircut is best to have to wear the headphones of the radio. And it's like, it's amazing because then it's like the body's actually transforming to interact with this piece of kit that suddenly you have. But then there's this intimacy,
They all had to wear evening dress, didn't they, to read the news? On the BBCs.
I mean, obviously, there's just one bit of radio from that time that exists. So we can hear Schoen's voice, and in a discussion, no Benjamin voice has been found, which is really sad. And I don't know. I mean, there's a bit of the sort of Weimar radio, and it doesn't feel quite as stilted and plummy as BBC.
That's what's so interesting about what you said, that sort of the BBC kind of sclerotic and, sort of lumpy, and yet the radio in Germany in the 20s being much more. So that so kind of confounds, in my ignorance, what I would have
it's true.
expected. And it's funny because, one of the reasons Schoen certainly can't get a role as an announcer on British radio. Partly he did have a stammer. I don't know if that was a factor, but he simply did not have the right voice. And the Germans and Austrians that they allowed to announce sort of on the kind of World Service announce had to have a really particular type of German accent that fitted the model. And, I think that was continuous through the service. If you got to speak on the radio, you had to have a particular kind of voice.
Bertolt Brecht also proposed that radio should move beyond mere distribution to become a tool of communication, allowing listeners to speak as well as hear, and organising them as contributors. In what ways did radio offer radical political potential, and how did Schoen engage with this vision?
Partly extending the audience yet to come on and make it a really discursive medium. Then there's this feedback loop through the radio magazine. I think partly the sort of the interest in the kind of meta nature of it engages people to sort of reflect on what the medium is. So there's this lovely radio play that Benjamin writes that I think Schoen performs in it, or he certainly urges it, and it's called Much Ado About Casper.
It's co-written by them both, right?
Yeah. And it's a story of a sort of cartoonic kind of figure, Casper, who's with the radio station and trying to record, and he's trying to evade them. It's a sort of knockabout comedy, all with spoken word, sound effects, and so on. And it's pedagogical in the sense that it's also about the situation of having yourself and your voice and your intellectual productions are captured for radio, and what would be the recompense for that. So I think that sort of almost like meta or self-reflexive kind of level is a way of trying to engage audiences to think about how relations, infrastructure, structural relations between them and their homes or in their classrooms with their school radio as well, and the radio station.
There's another play that Benjamin writes, not with Schoen, but with this guy, Wolf Zucker, which is called How to Ask Your Boss for a Pay Rise. It's kind of this repetitive scene where someone's being encouraged to approach their boss in like different ways. So, like you come out from the meeting and you did it kind of wrong, and then you get like a pep talk about how to go back in and re-ask the boss. But it actually becomes a sort of, that's what a learning play is as well. It's demonstrative and it shows you how to do it, denaturalizes that moment or something. And then when it was broadcast on the radio, there was like a round table with Benjamin and some trade unionists, which seems very unlikely. Like Dr. Benjamin will appear on the radio talking about labor rights, but the play is like really funny to hear and read out. And then there's a very serious conversation about actually how to ask your boss for a pay rise, and if that's possible.
So it's a kind of pedagogical element, I guess, but it's a sort of militant pedagogy rather than a Reithian one, which is the BBC one of embetterment, in terms of dragging people up by the scruff of their necks or whatever. It's about how do you equip yourself in this modern democratic age of, cutthroat capitalism, take your place in this world, and how can you improve it? So partly it's about content programming. Partly, one of the things though that the radio yearbooks and the radio magazines really focused on was something that Adorno mocks around the same time, but it's the radio how to build a radio, how to understand this technology that is not magic, that was presented as through the ether and magical and so on. Well, actually, these are waves that are being captured and sent through amplifiers. How does this work? We can make them. And if we can make them, then we can become.
Also, there's a nice image to go back to Brecht. He makes this allusion to the idea that radio was still in its infancy, that it was a medium that had to grow up like a child has to grow up, or he'll be forced to do so. And I guess maybe that image is interesting because in some ways maybe Brecht and Benjamin and Schoen wanted to keep radio in its infancy, like keep it experimental, keep it without a set notion of standard and rule and law, and to make sure that it's unruly.
Even I think in the darkest times, there's a very lovely, sad poem by Brecht. And one can think of in a situation that Benjamin writes about, where they're in exile outside of Germany and then tuning in to hear Hitler's broadcasts, because of course the Nazis found their own way to really use radio, and they want to hear his voice and hear what he's saying. When he gets to America, Brecht writes a poem, "To my little radio apparatus, you have come with me in all this exile because I need you. Do not fail me, because it's the only way in which I can keep in touch with the world, even if what I'm hearing produces immense pain for me or is lies. I still need that connection."
As a medium, it was just able to be more radical, more avant-garde. It's a funny analogy, but in the early days of telly, there wasn't really the concept of a chat show. So you had a woman, of course, in her kitchen and two other women, and they'd all be caftan. So, "Oh, hello," as they come up the path and knock on the door. Let's talk about recipes, something, because then, of course, the front door and everything fell away when it became a thing. I just wonder whether radio, somehow not being visual, was freer and able to be more kind of protein from a sort of early.
think partly, each radio network within Germany, and it was all decentralized and done state by state, was kind of finding its own way and sometimes competing with each other. So there was a sort of plethora of things you could do. Who can get to do the outside broadcast best? Who can put a lion on the video? It's just sort of about doing that. Maybe the heavily centralized BBC didn't have that impetus, or didn't have that different things, and that then set the pattern for TV subsequently.
It's really interesting hearing you describe the development of the technology and how it finds its shape within the society that it's evolving in. And it kind of reminds me a little bit about the beginnings of the internet. And how sadly it seems both technologies just seem to have been, kind of creativity gets squeezed out and they become the instruments of the most dominant power structures of the time.
I mean, there are dovetail parallels. What's so clear about the development of the internet is the commercial relations. And I guess ARPANET and the early days, it's basically been a commercial space that's been more and more monopolized, I suppose, and with a kind of speed up effect. So, I was looking at various discourse today on how use of Google has become so rapidly because so many of the responses are bringing back AI gibberish, basically. And so it's just kind of killed itself in a sense. But even that was a development on from the early days of ARPANET, when I sort of first remember the message boards, which sort of exist in a weird way, don't they, on Discord. And for me, that would be the sort of infant, extremely textual medium, which still kind of continues the broader picture of it. It's just the questions of profit squeeze and extraction and so on, which is probably done to an even greater degree than TV, because you could sort of argue that some of those newer providers, like Netflix and so on, are they still in a sort of experimental stage of trying to get shows so you get unexpected points of interest there, and it hasn't just settled into predictable content in the way that now radio seems to be extremely highly market segmented. And I was out of town, I had to go out of town and couldn't listen to my usual poison, which will do very consciously as a poison, which is LBC, full of reactionary stuff, but, like Brecht, and so I want to keep in contact with those thoughts somehow. I was out of town, I had to listen to Radio 4. Constant sort of softened little blanket. I don't know, it is so to be Radio 4 like, and there's no sort of eruption. I mean, I'm sure there may well be crowds, I don't mean to stop anyone. But I think, that these things have become, this is the expected content. You're not going to switch it on and suddenly have a real surprise. Whereas I think you just switched on Frankfurt radio in 1926 and heard something, what in God's name is that? It's radio feedback, or it's some mad radio play, or there's some strange opera that someone keeps cutting into with a clown noise. And it would have been challenging somehow, and it would have been meant to disorient you and then make you orient yourself.
Am I right also thinking that the word worker run web radio stations and stuff like that?
Yeah, there was a lot of discussion in Communist magazine, both about how to understand it technically, so you could build your own, how to tune into radio in Moscow and all of that sort of stuff, and what are the interests of the worker in this new media. It was interesting in post-89 when Berlin Wall came down, in Romania and the various sort of Eastern Bloc countries. There was the TV and radio stations that were occupied. Seizing that means of communication was really important. I remember seeing in Romania a shaggy bunch of people kind of crowded into this TV station.
Same in the Portuguese Revolution,
Yeah.
Carnation.
Whereas now it's more dispersed. Where would people go? Would they try and no? But because we're all fragmented anyway in our listening and niche.
Coming back to Netflix, I think it's very odd to me, the idea of being ancient and having watched in telly, being there where if you didn't see it when it went out, that was that. And now, to me, the idea of binging is so weird that it's not punctuated by the time of a week. There's a great book about sleep as well. You only have sleep mode now.
There's a question about sleep because we write a lot about sleep. So like Schoen kept this dream diary for many years, and lots of the dreams are actually dreamt whilst at work in the sleep room of the BBC.
Yeah, you would listen to radio in a foreign country and then translate it into English to supply report. The 24-hour building. So they would sleep there and then be woken, for their shift by a porter shining the torch in their eyes.
But what's amazing about this stage of his life, he's sleeping at the BBC in the sleep room, dreaming about the BBC, and like how to get out of the building, going down the wrong stairs, coming out, missing the bus, being surprised by a colleague. Yeah, literally in the sleep room, yeah.
Program making broadcast has been available for.
Yeah. But I guess what was different was they had this infrastructure, and in 1926-7, this broadcasting hall was built, like high modernism, like everything you could possibly need to make a program in any form, right? So there's something about that that's important. And maybe one thing that we lack in some ways now is infrastructure, or, like everyone has the mic and some form of recording, but I feel like there was even like a sort of swimming pool or something. Like it was extremely high tech. Or even just like having a radio orchestra that could produce the music. It's not just scored music, it's just anything.
And I guess he wanted to be back as part of that, but he's not able to. So his outlets really are just become translation.
That's why the dreams became important, because they were kind of the avant-garde practice in this private life. Like, this thing that used to be a surrealist move, something that was revolutionary, to write down your dreams and think about transforming reality through dreams, just became this kind of neurotic recording about your workplace and when you sleep at work as well.
One of the few big commissions the BBC gave him was to go to Germany in 1947 and assess the state of media in the British quarter mainly, but also to compare it to what was happening in the American sector, the French, the German, the French, American, British, not the Russian, who wasn't sent to the East. He writes a report for the BBC, which is very damning about what the British are doing there.
Is not engaging the audiences. Look at what the Americans are doing. Like they're playing jazz. They're doing much more interesting stuff with the radio. The BBC has left Germany. He goes back to Frankfurt to, his old stomping ground, finds, his house destroyed. We've got a moving scene that he writes in his own personal diary about that trip, not for the BBC, for himself.
Doesn't he find the water fountain that used to be inside his...
Sort of does that sort of reflex gesture of turning it off. And
there's this whole rumination, and he goes to the radio station and he finds that some of the old Nazi guys are just still in charge, just haven't kicked them out. It's another one of those kind of
shock, not shocks, in the sense that he knows it's going to happen, but it's also really wounding. And he's saying, well, is there a role for me here?
And there's a great irony to his life, which is that his arrest in 1933 was based on the fact that he had supposedly cut the radio line during a Hitler speech. And that was what the police took forward in the case against him, which led to his imprisonment twice in Frankfurt and then in Hamburg, and then his escape. So it's like his whole life, in some ways, revolved around that moment of the cutting of the line, or the mythical cutting of the line.
So intrigued when you talk about, getting a real lion roaring on the radio. Sit that next to the kind of simulacra of reality, which was so codified at the BBC with records that were played, which was sort of, a blackbird at dawn, or somebody clip-clopping down the road or something, and those sounds were kind of frozen and then dropped in, which again sounds very different from, because there wasn't all of that then in the 20s, so it had much more.
Though I suddenly thought of a man whose name I can't remember, but he was a German that the BBC employed who could imitate every single bird that.
So I really loved your description of Schoen's music for children, where you note that his songs avoid a prescription of childlike innocence, rather addressing their audience with vitality, humour and dissonance, modernist, jerky and atonal. How did Schoen's innovation around music, particularly children's music, how was it reflected in the broader sort of experimental approach to sort of music?
Well, I think we should listen to some. No? They're extremely short. I'll come up and do the controls, and then Esther will read the verses. So
the first one here is called Prelude. Translation is, every single day, Father Christmas comes, sings your little song, runs off then because he can. Every single day, the sunrise happens, lunch happens.
Alle Tage wieder kommt der Weihnachtsmann, singt zwei kleine Lieder, läuft dann, was kann. Alle Tage wieder kommt ein Morgenrot, kommt ein Mittagessen, kommt ein Abendbrot.
Second one's called Dialogue. A woman in Grunau whose husband approaches us. Why? Because Palm Sunday, Lirum Larum.
it's like a 12-second movement.
Third one, Stella Natur, hush little child, hush, your father was a stork, egg laid by the Easter rabbit, and the dog has a nose, Fischer, Fischer. If you go to the table to eat.
Horch, Kindchen, horch, dein Vater war ein Storch. Eier legt der Osterhase und das Huhn hat einen Hase. Mach Pische, Pische, wenn du was zu Tische.
Bad luck rarely comes alone. A soldier in the city of Warsaw, named Marie, has yellow trousers, got shot to death, but who cares?
Ein Soldat in der Stadt war so wie Miss Marie, hatte goldene Hosen, wurde totgeschossen. Na und wie?
Sentiments, little hush babies, hush-a-bye, make little eggs, make egg-a-leg, little hush babies, hush, hush the hand. Begin the song from the start again, little hush babies, hush.
Euer Puderchen, euer Puder, mach ei, ei, eichen, mach ei, ei, ei. Euer Puderchen, euer Puder, fang das Lied von vorne an. Euer Puderchen, euer Puder.
It's the last one, isn't it? ABC?
Yeah.
Say A with the finger, B with the toe, say what the little thumb caught with the little finger, A, B, C, D, E, C, D, F, G.
Sage A mit dem Finger, sage B mit dem C, sage, was der Däumerling mit dem kleinen Finger fing. A, B, C, D, E, C, D, E, F, G.
I don't know being raised.
Yeah.
They got quite political planning at the time. You found a review.
Yeah, so this guy, Steinhagen, wrote, unless atonality is strictly excluded from the children's curriculum, the next generation will be utterly incapable of appreciating the classical and romantic masterpieces. How can we explain to a child the world of significance that lies in a Schumann harmony if its ears are rendered insensitive by the action of cruel discords? We found this flyer of we found the manuscripts. They were already recorded, but we found the flyer of the context of the children's pieces being played, and it was kind of hard to know if kids were there, but I think they were. It seems kind of an amazing setting, all these kind of atonal pieces that were quite hard to listen to now being presented, and it's a new training of the ears or something. I guess that's the point. It's like the reaction, right? Because precisely listening to the Schumann harmony is like about like training the body to be at place or something in your seat. Like you clap at the right moments. And
all of this will become so significant just a few years later when Second Viennese School and all of that stuff is dismissed as degenerate, and there's a very limited type of music that you can hear. And and again it's that idea of, well, if this is what your body is trained to accept, what are all the concomitant political acceptances and social acceptances?
Yeah, like why not allow the child to learn that they can laugh and react to funny music or atonal music? Or
it sort of reminds me a bit of, in some ways, how workers are sometimes treated as well, as if, especially like socialist realism and stuff, as if they're not going to get it. But actually, I think children and workers get sort of these things. And it's not like
the parents might not get it.
It's a similar argument you can make around Finnegan's Wake, isn't it? Some people say, you need so much knowledge and it all comes down Finnegan's Wake. Or you can just read it and just find it absurd and laugh at it, and it's the most accessible book ever, So it's...
Well, it's a bit like, why is Debussy and his atonality accepted? Because he was accepted as one of the greatest pianists of all time. But some of his stuff is quite atonal and dissonant, but he just kind of panders to the romantic era of resolve at the end of it. But there's a lot in some of his work and his exercises that is just a bit mad.
So the story of Schoen and his family's escape from Nazi Germany is a powerful one, and one that could have ended very differently. So while they survived, this moment marks a kind of rupture in Schoen's life. Could you share a bit more about that escape and how it shaped his later life?
He's arrested very early on. Partly there's this idea about cutting the line when he's been engaging too many communist and Jewish speakers. So he's arrested, manages to get a release, but then he's rearrested, probably betrayed by May. There's some discussion about how long he spends in this prison in Hamburg, which you visited. Yeah. He writes a long poem about his time there, and clearly he writes these poems in a collection called London Elegies. It's at 1950 it's published, but they're written through the 40s. He clearly felt really guilty because he did manage to escape, possibly because his wife went to Berlin and did this act on the promise that he would be released on condition that he got straight onto a ship and came to England. He didn't know that had happened and just thought he'd been released by magic or because Lord Reith or someone in Britain had insisted upon it.
Anthony Asquith,
who was the son of the Prime Minister and famous actor. And the whole Bonham Carters, they were all involved in getting people out, and initially when they came they were kept into a park home by the bottom. I think he felt guilty about it. In the poem, he talks about talking to people in prison who were in prison because they'd done communist agitation and other things and really suffered, and I think was quite convinced they probably died in prison, and he'd had this sort of lucky escape and was able to kind of start again in London. And what we tracked from his little pocket diary was him attempting to map who was around, who could be helpful, and then going to the News of the World offices, this and that newspaper office, just begging for work. But he gets this sort of he gets a position at the BBC, but it's in this thing called the listening service. So, he goes from broadcasting to being like a pair of ears who can understand the German, and he also spoke French and Russian, and maybe he was engaged in translating for various languages, reporting, writing little reports, and that being part to someone else, and doing that as a kind of shift work. I think he must have eventually got an okay wage because they moved to this rather nice modernist development in Kingston upon Thames.
New Moseley? Is that what you said?
East Moseley.
East Moseley.
It's 1930s, the boat-like development.
Like tennis courts and a cocktail bar.
Yeah. They're clearly treated as sort of these other strange foreigners.
There's like letters of complaint of dropping too many fish bones out the window and like strange, yeah.
But they lasted out until 58 and then 52, rather, and then go back to Berlin. And that's where his wife Hansi Johanna really fights for compensation, for the imprisonment, for the deterioration in his health from that point onwards, and for compensation for the radio. Why didn't you protect him and so on? And it's really, really hard. No one wants to really pay or accept it. But it does mean there's a lot of papers that you found here in an archive in Berlin, which is the whole compensation case, through which it became clear his mother was Jewish, which hadn't been particularly clear before, and that she'd been taken to concentration camp. And all sorts of other details came out to me.
Also that his stammer had worsened because of the trauma 33. I mean, also like Hansi, his wife, writes to Adorno. It's almost like she asks him to draw these diagrams. Like, what was the house like? We need proof. Like, I need someone else.
We lost everything in Frankfurt, and we ended up living in really strange circumstances, at least initially in England, with furniture donated by a Quaker charity.
Yes, like tell us where the painting was. Like describe it for me.
All the things that we've lost. Teddy and Adorno, you visited our house. Can you testify to the amount that you've lost for a restitution case? But
I mean, I guess what fascinates me about Schoen is like we kind of talk about him as a everyman or something, but also in the way that we're all existing subject to history, but all intervening in some ways into that history. And I feel like he's a test case of that in a way, that he's dealt all of these fates, but he's always trying to fight them and manipulate them and resist them at the same time that they're just you can't really something. I guess that's my lesson from thinking a lot about his life. Or, I don't know.
That sometimes fate does just go against you, or it's a broader sort of history. It's maybe a bit of a miserable one in a sense, but I suppose my sense of it is, maybe it's a traditional sense, there's a lot of possibility around that sort of epoch of the pre-First World War, for sure. There's a sort of moving towards, the openness of the Russian Revolution. You get the explosion of all these artistic movements in a kind of response to an expanded political field and the extension of democracy. And the First World War almost sort of reinforces that, in the sense that it galvanizes people, against war and feeds a kind of internationalism. But because that becomes such a challenge, it takes this monstrosity of fascism, not just in Germany, but in Spain, in Italy, this broad movement to try and nip all of that in the bud and attack it both in terms of working class self-organisation and artistic efflorescence and inquiry. So all of that is sort of stopped. And then after the Second World War, it seems to be built up. In Germany, the avant-garde comes back as documenta, as a sort of, to show just how anti-fascist we are, to pick up the threads, but they're not really picking up the threads. They're just producing a kind of art market.
There's actually Nazi store running it.
Yeah. Tepid kind of experimentalism, but that has its place. And I suppose you could think about things like Darmstadt, where Adorno is going. There's the realm of experimental music, and they are pushing the boundaries. There's all sorts of interesting stuff happening, but it doesn't really matter in the way that it might have mattered if it was happening in 1918 or something. So in a way, I guess we're using Schoen's individual fate to sort of map something that's a bit depressing if you don't share the sentiment that postmodernism or the contemporary has opened up its possibility. Maybe it has, but I guess it's not how I predominantly see things. But then I'm just one individual, or maybe we wrote it because we felt it could speak into a moment where there are certain effervescences. You're mentioning having your own radio station. Sam, works one. My partner broadcasts on a couple of digital base stations, and these things are also possible and brilliant as well. So it feels very fragmented, I guess, and you can do amazing stuff and no one listens. Maybe people felt that in 1924, I don't know, but I think they felt they were building something.
So thank you both so much for coming. It's been really, really fascinating.
Yeah, it's so nice that you can just also talk.
Yeah.